Hey everybody, Eric here again, and this week we are talking about science fiction and popular culture. This week you are also completing Roadside Picnic, the novel by Arkady and Boris Strugatsky. So I'm not going to talk about that story as much. I made a separate video about that story, about that novel, and I posted it last week at the outset when you began the novel. And so this week I just want to talk about the pop culture assignment, talk about science fiction and popular culture. Science fiction is an element of popular culture, so there is a little bit of, I don't know, irony is probably not the right word. It's a little obtuse to say science fiction, popular culture. Science fiction is popular culture. But this is a college course, it's not super long, and there's so many other aspects of science fiction we can explore other than literature that I want to give us an opportunity to look at some of those other elements of science fiction. And I want to have a week where you can gravitate towards the things that interest you about science fiction, something that's new or interesting that I am not directly saying you have to write about in the course. You know, we look at lots of stories. There's a post about film. There's opportunities to write your own science fiction and learn about how science fiction gets published. But again, that's about literature. And so this week, I'm asking you to think about science fiction more broadly. So, other than books and stories, other than movies and television shows, which are covered in other posts and in other parts of the course, science fiction has representation in many other arts and forms of entertainment. Video games are the most obvious one that comes to my mind. And so, if you're a gamer and you know something about science fiction, games, don't feel bad that I didn't dedicate a whole week to games like I did to film. This is your week to write about gaming, and let me have it. I want to know what is the new, interesting science fiction based games. What are you playing? Of course, in my old head, I still think of something like Halo as being a science fiction game, and that's actually a joke because Halo still feels kind of new to me. And my real science fiction game is Metroid. I played a lot of Metroid in the 80s and the early 90s. But even as old as, the original Atari, you were playing games with spaceships attacking Earth and shooting them down and meteors. And science fiction became an element of video games. And really, they kind of came out of the same thing, right? Like the same fans of science fiction were some of the first people who video games were marketed to, and they were some of the first consumers of video games because gaming was a new technology, and science fiction fans are people who care about new technology. So if you want to write about games, that's great. I personally love science fiction art. I like the old school 70s Frank Frazetta style art a lot, where they had the sort of detailed, semi-realistic covers with unrealistic looking people on them. I don't necessarily like the sort of sparse retro science fiction covers that a lot of novels seem to have today. I prefer the sort of retro style. And if you go and look at some of those older science fiction covers, some of them are really crazy and far out. I've mentioned the story Rendezvous with Rama by Arthur C. Clarke in this course a couple times. It's a novel. I totally recommend you read it. If you don't have time to read it, there's an Instagram account that you can follow. It's called Rendezvous with Ramen, like the noodles, Rendezvous with Ramen. And that poster puts up retro science fiction covers to novels. So I really enjoy following. I don't know who makes Rendezvous with Ramen, but really good job. If they ever happen to see this, it's really great to see all those old sci-fi covers. So art is something you might look at if you want to write about science fiction and popular culture. There are languages, and like the Klingon language that people came up with and actually translate books into the Klingon language. Klingons being the prime nemesis in the original Star Trek series, and Worf, of course, was the friendly Klingon in The Next Generation. And honestly, I don't remember exactly what happened to Klingons after that. But they created a whole language. Fans of Star Trek created a whole language based on Klingon. Star Trek fans were some of the first people to go and have fan-specific conferences and conventions. Now, of course, there are sci-fi comic book, anime conventions all over the country. We have one in Tucson. There's one in Phoenix. Of course, the San Diego Comic-Con is the biggest example of a convention. If you would like to write about fandom, cosplay, any of those sorts of things for this assignment, great, I'm interested to read it. I always find it really impressive how realistic some people can make the costumes that they wear to some of those conventions. And if that's something that you're into, I would be fascinated to learn more about it and to read your experiences as part of that subculture. There is science fiction music. There's some sort of heavy-handed science fiction music, like some of the Coheed and Cambria albums from 15 years ago, which had just sort of blatant science fiction themes. And then there's other music that may be influenced by, or at least the art that's related to the music is influenced by science fiction culture. Of course, electronic music, synthesizer music, these forms of music have some significant overlap with science fiction because, again, science fiction cares about technological advancement, and those types of electronic music represent technological advancement. So if you are someone who wants to write about science fiction and music, I would be very interested to read about that. I don't watch as many fashion shows as some people do, but my wife likes to watch fashion shows on YouTube, and it's kind of cool if that's something you're into. I suggest it. One thing I notice is that a lot of those fashion designers have a pretty interesting influence from what appear to be science fiction. These are people who are trying to figure out what fashion is going to look like in the future. They are trend setting. They're not designing fashion for the past, right? They're designing fashion for the future. And so they look to the future, and science fiction looks to the future. And sometimes I think fashion and sci-fi, at least high fashion, there's somewhat of an overlap there too. My point here is whatever you're into, whatever interests you, there may be a overlap with science fiction. And for this popular culture assignment, I want you to choose something that interests you. Look at how science fiction influences it, how science fiction may be manifested in whatever that art form or technological, form is, and write about it. And I hope you find something new. I hope you find something cool. Read each other's posts and comment on each other's posts. This is a week where if you go through what other people write about, you're going to find a real diverse array of new things. And it's far more enriching to read what each other write for this week than just to write what you do and give it to me for my feedback. Definitely read each other's posts, comment, give suggestions of new things that other people might think are cool, and have fun with it.